Music theory, modal system versus traditional system. This here being a list of the key differences, each one of these key differences destined to be dived into more deeply in future presentations. But first, a quick recap of a prior presentation where we laid out the general argument for a mode-based system as opposed to a relative scale-based system, arguing that in particular on the guitar, although it does work for other instruments, including the piano as well, it will be easier for us to navigate around the fretboard, memorize the fretboard in such a way that we can be more mobile on it. Noting and remembering that our musical system has 12 notes in it, we will typically apply our musical formula, which we're going to accept a priori for now, meaning we're just going to accept it as is, possibly diving a little bit deeper into why it was created in the future, that resulting in 7 notes. So this is going to be our scale, which we often start off thinking as the major scale, but noting that if I renumber the system from any point in the scale, that gives us our modes, the most common second mode being the minor scale, otherwise known as the Aeolian mode, which would simply be numbered with this as the 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you can see that our whole system is based on this idea of renumbering the modes within a particular system. So I'm arguing here then what we should be centering around to learn faster would be to memorize the actual relative positions on the guitar by what you might call a nodal centered system or a modal centered system. So remember, the 3 ways that you might learn all of the positions on the guitar are: 1, memorize all the notes, which is good, but it's not something that can help you to play within a system of 7 notes, because you're not playing all 12 notes. You're going to be at least centering around some type of scale, which is a collection of 7 notes, which you could further trim down if you wanted to a 5-note scale from those 7 notes. You could also memorize the fretboard in terms of relative positions, meaning I'm going to give it the major scale position. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3. That has its advantages because then you can shift those relative positions as we go from a C major, shifting up to a D major or D sharp, and so on and so forth. But you end up with 7 different numbering systems within the same set of diatonic scales, within the same set of modes. That becomes a problem for memorizing the fretboard. So what can we do instead? Memorize the modal position, which we usually name with these Greek letter names, but you will in the future apply a numbering system that will be absolute, not relative, won't change, and therefore those points will always be the same. So whether we're shifting our focal point within a particular shape, that would be changing our focal point within one of the 7 modes with the same 7 notes, the same diatonic scale, or whether we're moving from one relative position and shifting, copying, and pasting the whole thing up, we will then still be able to identify that this relative position is the Ionian position. No matter what note it happens to be, it's going to be in the same relative shape, just like copying and pasting in an Excel worksheet. Now, if you accept that argument, that that's the easiest thing to memorize, which I think is unquestionable, then you're going to be led to the problem of the current system that we have. The way we write things down is based on renumbering every time we move to a different chord. So that means that our interval naming system, as well as our chord naming system, is based on forcing us to change the relative position of every note as we move through the modes. Not only that, but it also results in the same name for different chord shapes as we move through, as we look at different shapes within our position. In other words, if I'm going to play a C with these 7 notes, if I play what we would typically call in a major scale a 1, 4, 5, chords built off of the 1, the 4, and the 5, we're going to name all 3 of those chords under the traditional system as a major chord. Why is that a problem? because it basically, as though we're going to start thinking as though we're moving through three different shapes, meaning C major to F major to G major, which isn't really what we're usually thinking of. We're playing three different chords that fit in the same master shape. So if we were to change our naming convention to a modal-centered system, then that would more naturally tell ourselves exactly what we're doing. So again, I know that sounds, we're going to get a little bit into the weeds here, a lot into the weeds, but I'm just going to list out the consequences. And remember that each step along the way, you can then ask the question of how much benefit would I have if I learned something in a more efficient system. I'm going to argue that the way we're looking at it, if there wasn't any historical context, would be more efficient. And then the question is always, well, if I'm going to learn that particular part or that particular system, is that benefit great enough that I would have to overcome the problem of translation or bridging to the current system kind of for communication? Now, I would argue that this learning a modal structure is undoubtedly worth your time. And then every step we go from there, as we then look into the naming conventions, then again, you have to keep on repeating and asking these questions. I'll make the argument in more detail in future presentations. We'll just list out what the consequences will basically be. So the modal system versus the traditional system, key differences. If you accept the core argument from our prior presentation, so my idea would be here that we're going to say, yeah, I do think that learning that modal-centered system will make learning the fretboard easier. Then this leads us down a rabbit hole of, well, how am I going to deal with the fact that the current system language is forcing me to talk in a particular way? And I don't know if you live in the United States, like in California here, you can kind of see how the terminology does impact how you think. And you can see that because the super progressive people keep on changing the words, hoping that changes kind of reality, right? They just basically make up a new. So it is the fact that the terms that we're using for things does have an influence on us. And in the current system, the terms that we're using are basically leading us to believe that we have all these different scales, even though we're playing the one master shape. It leads us to believe that the major scale is the primary scale and all of the other scales are kind of secondary, the minor scale being the next secondary, and then there's like a hierarchy of scales, which you can kind of argue for if you say which are the most used scales and whatnot, the favorite scales, but they're all kind of connected together. So those are some of the, so those are some of the things that it tends to lead us to do. It also leads us to think in terms of relative scale positions as opposed to modal positions. So let's kind of map those things out and at least be aware of them, and then think about how we want to deal with that. So methodological changes. Now, some of these changes don't have to do with the modal system. I think they're just other things that people haven't picked up. I'll talk into why about that in future presentations, but the same argument applies. That is the way I'm looking at it objectively better if we didn't have all of the baggage of history that's kind of pointing towards one way of doing things? And if it is, then the question is, which I think it is, I think I can clearly make that argument, then the question is it worth me looking at it this way, given the fact that it's different than other things in the communication problem? So one thing is we're going to be displaying the guitar fretboard with the top string on top. That means the low E string for easier visualability. So that means when I play my guitar, if I was playing the guitar on a camera, you would be facing me playing the guitar. So notice the guitar neck is going to be facing to the right. But when you're looking at the screen, your guitar neck is going to be facing the opposite direction. So what I'd like to do is flip the guitar around. So I'm going to be doing more theory stuff at the beginning here and less actually playing the guitar. But when I do play the guitar, I typically rotate the guitar around or mirror the guitar, which you can easily do in software, but no one ever does it. And I'll talk more in future presentations about why no one ever does it. But I think if you think about it and you're trying to learn the basics, it's easier to mirror what I'm doing, even though it looks like I'm left-handed, than it is to try to twist or flip the guitar in your mind. So if I flip it around this way, you have the heavy string on top. So that's one thing I'm going to do that's going to be a little bit different, which I think will be easier. Why wouldn't you adopt that if it's easier? You might say, well, because then when I watch other people, I'm going to have to flip it around in my mind, so I might as well learn that way. Okay, but I still think that it would be easier for you to first visualize in a way that allows you to learn the guitar as fast as possible. And then if you want to watch other people and be able to flip the guitar around in your mind, you can still do that. I don't think it prevents you from doing that, but that's my argument there. Platform and tools. So all learning tools and charts will be built in Excel, which we argue is the most underutilized, powerful tool for learning music. In this guitar and I'm an accountant's humble opinion, it's shocking, worrisome, and disappointing that Excel isn't standard in musical education. Now, I'm going to get into this in more detail as well, the argument on why I think Excel really, like if you're taking a music major, particularly if you're using a guitar or some other string instrument other than maybe the piano, although the piano as well with general music theory, you should be using Excel, I believe, because just normal music theory is a bunch of charts, which obviously you can create in Excel. So if you want to copy and paste and move things around, compare things, there's nothing better than Excel. And clearly with, of course, the guitar, you have a fretboard, which looks like an Excel sheet. It's a grid, which maps perfectly onto an Excel sheet. So it's amazing that nobody kind of uses Excel to map this stuff out. And I'll try to talk about why I think that might be, but I think that that is something that should change. Now, also note that there's a bunch of cool softwares out there, and you might say, well, look, I can use all these cool database softwares that help me. And I can kind of attest to this in a similar way as within accounting. I'm an accountant teacher as well, and I have people saying, well, look, you can just use QuickBooks, and it's a lot easier to learn with QuickBooks or some other accounting software. And the idea would be, well, that's a data input software, and you can learn with it. But notice what the problem is the design of that software is to put in a particular input and then it gives you an output, but you don't know how it got from the input to the output. So that's great for some functional use, but it's not great for learning how the system works, which of course, in particular with the guitar, that's what we want to do. I don't want to put in an input and then it spits out an output. I mean, that might be good sometimes, but what I want to do oftentimes is see how the input is being used to create the output. The most transparent way to do that is simply an Excel sheet. And just note that you can think of a database program as, in essence, a 3D version of kind of like a 2D Excel sheet. So if you go into the 3D version, you have to go into the magic box for it to magically do something. If you don't know how to code it, you're not going to see the magic work. In a 2D system and just an Excel sheet, you can create the sheet. You see all the connections. That's good. You want that if you're trying to learn how the system works. All right, anyways, learning materials, worksheets, and fretboard diagrams will follow the inverted string orientation for consistency. So in other words, when we look at guitar music, note that if you're learning something like classical piano or something like that, you're going to learn sheet music, which is very specific. It's designed to try to express exactly what the person wants you to do. Whereas if you play something like on the guitar, then it's usually more improvisy, meaning I'm going to give you the general outline of the chords and the notes and the melody, but then you can kind of jam and put those chords together in different ways. In other words, the sheet music can give you too much of a straitjacket to restrict you too much. But the chord system is sometimes too loose. It doesn't give you enough to know the general framework that I want to be working within. But notice that the tablature still kind of is created as though we're looking at the guitar this way. So it puts the little string on top. So the tablature is designed to be easier. So when you look at chord charts and tab charts, you got to flip the guitar around, which I think is just what happened traditionally, how they set up those things, and now that's kind of codified. But I would argue that you would ideally want to have the guitar mapped out this way from the perspective of us behind the guitar with the heavy string on top. So I think that's just obviously better and easier to visualize. But let me show you what I mean here. See, I'm going to put this is the low or heavy string on top of my worksheets when I map out the fretboard. I'm not going to have this be the high string, the one closest to the floor when you're playing. But if you look at tablature, that's the way it's laid out, right? Meaning this string up top is not the one closest to the ceiling when you're playing. It's oftentimes the small string. And when you look at chord charts, sometimes they put it vertically. So now the guitar is orientated downwards. I think that's their attempt to try to get it closer to the top, but it's still as though you turned the guitar from here, like you rotated it so the fretboard is vertical. But you don't visualize the guitar that way, you visualize it this way. So you might as well write it down as easy as possible. Now again, you can argue that I don't want to do that. I want to learn it with the little string on top because that's how traditional tablature is written, and it's going to make it harder for me to read later. Now, I don't think that's a valid argument because I think that you can learn to rotate the guitar around in your mind. What you want to do is, when you're thinking about the theory, is to focus all of your attention on the theory. I want to orient the guitar in a way that allows me to focus directly on the theory and then be able to rotate it around. I don't think it restricts you from being able to visualize the guitar from different angles at later times when you're looking at different resources and whatnot. In any case, numbering system. So these are things that are going to follow from the nodal centered kind. Well, this one actually doesn't. So this is going to be a numbering system for the notes. So this is also something I think that is just clearly better. And we'll get into the history as to why the current system is in place and then why we might change it a little bit, meaning there's 12 notes in the musical alphabet. You can see that we have these sharps and flats that are going to be in there, which I've noted a little bit differently than normal. We'll talk more about that later. Now, I don't think we can really remove that completely, and it's kind of nice to have letters for the notes because sometimes when we have all these different numbering systems, it's difficult to identify one numbering system for the other. So I don't think we can, I'm not proposing we remove those entirely, although if you were to create the music system from scratch, you might do that, right? You might say, I'm just going to make a numbering system of the notes 1 through 11 or 1 through 12. You can argue about what would be the best numbering system. Should I make A0 or should I make C0 or should I make it a 1? Should I make the A the 1? But the basic idea is that we should be able to apply simple math to the system. Why is that useful? Because if I'm moving distance-wise from a C to an A or an A to the C, whatever numbering system I have allows me to do simple math. Well, that's a distance of 4 minus 1, which is 3 steps away. You can't do that with the letters. And with the letters that are currently here, it's even difficult to count up the alphabet because of the sharp and flat issue. And you have the issue of 2 notes for one thing. So that's clearly not optimal. Now it comes up with some cool things happen from it, like scales have all the letters of the alphabet. You just need to know which ones to sharp and flat. So I'm going to talk more about that in the future, but I would argue that it's clearly the case that some kind of numbering system through the notes and then being able to code switch between your numbering system to the letters will be worth your time because it allows you to do simple math, which is clearly beneficial. So mode numbering system. Modes will be assigned an absolute number 1 through 7 for clarity. So similarly with the modes, we're going to be picking out the modes here. So we have the modes. Now the modes go into the same kind of order. So normally when we look at the modes, the problem is that if I want to think of like the Aeolian, the minor scale, I make this the 1 from a scale-centered system. But what I want to do is say, no, I want to give that an absolute mode number, which I'm going to base on the major scale. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Why is that beneficial? Because once again, the modes all go in the same order. So it's going to be easy for me to then say, if I'm looking at any scale that has 7 modes in it, there's 12 scales with 7 modal nodes in it, and those nodes are in order, then I can do simple math within the mode to see how many modal steps away a particular interval is, for example. And so we'll talk more about that later. So then interval thinking. Now, again, this is going to get into the weeds right now because you might not have a great grasp of intervals in and of themselves, particularly if you're a guitar player, because oftentimes we get mixed up between what an interval means in terms of the shape versus the actual half steps. Now, why is this a problem? Notice that if you're on a piano, it's not as much of a problem. The interval is just going to be the distance between two notes. A piano is kind of like you're on one string. So if I went from this note to this note, there'd be a distance of 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps. So I can easily see that on one string, but what if I go from this note to this note? Then it's going to, how do I know how far it is? It's not like a piano that's stacked on top of each other. I have to know there's a distance between the two strings of 5 usually, plus 1. So it's a 6 note away distance. So the way the intervals normally work is that we don't tell the half steps. We give it a name based on the relative position of the scale. So here's our scale shapes again. So if I'm in the major scale, I'm looking at the distance between this and the E. It's a third. It's going to be a major third. So we have this major third, minor third, which actually doesn't give you the distance in half steps. Okay, so that forces us into, once again, this thinking of scale positions and having to change our scale position. And that means that every time I change a chord, even though I'm in the same diatonic notes, I have to then think of it from a different numbering system perspective. That's going to be one of the major issues. Now, again, you can follow my logic in terms of how to deal with that issue, but at the very least, I think we should be aware, you have a better awareness of the issue and the way the system is forcing you to think kind of that way. And then what do you want to do about it? Should you change it or not? So we have the dual interval naming. We will use both relative names, e.g. major third, minor sixth, and distance-based labels. So particularly on the guitar, one thing I think we can do that's again, just objectively better, even if you use the same interval names, the interval names in the normal system being based on the idea that the major scale is the scale that everything else is created from, which isn't exactly true. If we built the system now, all the scales would probably be relative or the same, because they're all connected to each other. But that's the idea and then the minor scale is the second best scale, and all the other scales are kind of are lesser importance. So all the intervals are named on the major and kind of minor scale. So we have that. But even if we use that system, we can at least say, look, this is a major third. I'm going to call the major third a 4-note away major third. So when I'm on the piano and I can't see on the guitar, I can't see the actual distance for a major third, I can at least say it in my mind so I can remember the actual distance in half steps, which is our primary measuring tool. That would be like inches or centimeter, right? So we have the directional intervals. Directionality will be introduced. So in other words, notice that when we look at distance, even on a piano, distance goes both ways. If I start on a C, I can go to the right of the C, up pitch-wise, and I can go down as well. But notice the way our interval system works, it's as though we can only go in one direction. So if I go from, say, this G up to here, I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, a major fourth. So it's going to be a 4-note away major third. 4-note away major third. But what if I go from this note back to this note? I would count it, hey, look, that's going to be 2 notes back. But there's no real interval for 2 notes back. And the reason for this is when we start to envision like how our system works, we envision either a straight line of notes, they go up in a straight line, or we envision they go around in a circle. There's 12 notes like on a clock. In actuality, it's more like a spiral. They go up and repeat pitch-wise in a circle. So what we end up doing oftentimes is we create a system as though we're thinking like just as though they're on a clock, but we're not taking into account the octaves or directionality. So again, it's kind of getting into the weeds to say I'm going to say there's a negative interval. I'm going to say that I think logically that makes sense. I think logically on a guitar, I would like to be able to count from this C up to say like this G and say the distance and count the distance, but that's the negative distance. So then I would usually have to take the inverse. So there's pros and cons to using the system, but well, that's one of the outliers, or one of the things that follows, or one of the things I think would be put in place if we've thought of the system logically from this point. We'd say, hey, look, there's directionality is a thing. We can go higher in pitch and lower in pitch. We shouldn't have just a interval system based on going one direction like on a clock. So again, I'll talk more about that later. You can accept that argument or not as to whether you want to create intervals that go negative direction. So, but anyway, modal interval labels. So a new system will be used to name interval based on mode identity rather than only major or minor designations. So we might have something like an X4 for the Mixolydian fourth or something like that. So I'll actually then take the next logical step and say, okay, if we were creating the system from today, we wouldn't say, hey, look, the major scale is the master scale and all of the other modes are of lesser importance, and therefore I'm going to name all the distances as they are compared to the major scale. We would more likely say, hey, look, it makes a lot more sense to label everything from the modal, the relative modal position that we're in. That actually tells us a lot more from the context of the song, and it's more scalable, and so it makes a lot more sense. Now, again, you might say, okay, you've gone too far there. I'm not going to go in and learn a different modal system, but I would make the argument that when you make different chords, we should really be seeing the chords as does it fit diatonically into the scale that we're playing in. And if it does, it's useful to look at it from a modal scale port. The 1-4-5 goes from the Ionian mode to the Lydian mode to the Mixolydian mode, even though you could think about it as going from the one of a C of a major scale to the one of a major scale to the one of a major, right? An Ionian, Ionian, Ionian. But really, you're playing within the context of a song. So by thinking of it that way, you're actually confusing yourself, I think, right? It's actually more easy to think, no, I'm playing around a different node that's in the same master shape. I'm not going to be thinking of myself as in the same, as changing all the numbers within the shape. Again, we'll get into that argument later. So chord naming shifts. So we have the modal bass chord. Now, this same thing with the intervals happens with the same thing on the chords. We have this renumbering thing that makes us name the intervals based on forcing us to make the first one the one, right? As though we're in a different scale. And we have to make that the one instead of a nodal point, which would be 0.0 typically if we're looking at a node. Same thing is based on the chord construction. So when we look at normal chord construction, remember the idea of a chord is that we don't have the straitjacket of sheet music, which is too restrictive. That's like Beethoven is saying, hey, you play something that's slightly different than this. You didn't do it the way I said, and I'm the genius, right? And that's like, okay, that makes sense because Beethoven's the genius that's writing down the thing. It's like, okay. But when you start into other songs, other genres, such as in particular blues or jazz or something like that, you typically want the general outline, the kind of idea of the chord so that you have room to improvise within it. So that's kind of the idea of the chord system, to have more flexibility. However, we still don't have a lot of flexibility because I'd still like to maybe list out spread chords or something like that, because that might be the general idea of the song, meaning one of the notes is an octave up. And I'd still like to be able to look at the chord and say, what's the center point of the chord? Maybe change that, add notes to it or subtract notes, be able to list out a bar chord, which has repeated notes in it, or an open chord or something like that. So you can imagine a chord system that is a lot more, can do a lot more and is not tied to the idea of having the major scale as like the dominant scale that everything else is made from. They're all interwoven. They're all connected. You can derive all of the other modes from any of the other, like you can derive the major scale from the minor mode or minor scale as easily as you can derive the minor scale from the major scale. There's not one. It's like if you think about physics and where they come to the conclusion, Einstein is saying, hey, look, everything is relative. We're not in a special location when you're trying to think of our relative positions, right? The same thing is kind of true here. We got to this idea that the major scale is the position we have to view everything from, but in reality, it's not. It'd be better. I mean, if we at least recognize the fact that that's not exactly right. Anyways, modal-based construction. So again, you might say that you've gone too far on this. You're making up your own chord naming system, and that's fine. But when we get to this will be a ways out. Then I would say you have the same basis of the argument. You can say, okay, I want to see would this be logically the way I would do it if I was going to build the system from scratch without kind of like the constructions of history, if I was just to build the system at this point in time. And if so, I think logically, clearly it would be something like this. Then the question is, well, is it worthwhile for me to kind of learn a different system, or should I at least just be aware of what might be done today versus what I'm working with, so that I can at least understand and think a little bit out of the box, or not let the language force you to think a certain way. And I say that with everything, politics, and in particular. Don't let the language like force you into like a box because of the definitions they put in. So we will define chords by modal notes rather than major minor triads. So example X3, XG3. So in other words, I'm going to say, instead of saying this is a major or a minor, I'm going to define it by, in essence, the mode. Now you might say, hey, wait, if I have a triad, the mixolydian, if it's a 3-note chord or a 4-note chord, or let's just say a 3-note mixolydian, I'm going to say this is a 4-note chord, but we'll talk about that later. If it was a 3-note mixolydian, it would be the same notes as a 3-note Ionian. That's why we call it a major and a major. And it's true that those would end up being the same notes, but the mixolydian is in a different place on the fretboard. So if I build the shape around the mixolydian triad, it's got a different shape. So if I start adding other notes in it, then it's gonna be different. So I really think that if you looked at it from that perspective, it's gonna sound like it's more difficult, but I think it's more easy and more natural to what you're actually doing, which is moving around nodes within one master shape, as opposed to going from scale to scale, different scales, either Ionian or major to major, Ionian to Ionian, or major to a mixolydian or whatever. So inversion and spread awareness. So our system allows easy labeling of chord inversions, spread voicings, and non-root based naming. So again, you can imagine a system that would be pretty easy to do more than just label 3 chords. Now, normally what happens is you say, I'm going to build off the triad, which is thirds, distances of thirds stacked on each other, and then I can build further on top of those with the major, the major being our primary tool of measurement, the major scale. But that doesn't really allow us, and then we're going to say, well, then you can do different voicings. If you're playing the guitar, you can do whatever you want. You can add other things that are in that voicing, or add octaves or play within different octaves. However, although you might not want to go to sheet music, which is too restrictive, you might still want to say, hey, look, the thing that's cool about what I'm playing here is it happens to have this octave up of the third in the triad. So it's a triad, but the third is an octave higher or something like that. That's what gives me the feel that I'm trying to go for. I would like to be able to list that out easily in a chord name. Or I might say, hey, look, the thing that makes this cool is that it has an added note in it of some type. I would like to be able to add a note or something like that. So we'll come up with a system where you would think if you were building it from scratch, it would be fairly easy to do something like that, which isn't as restrictive as sheet music, but gives you more flexibility to write down exactly what you want in terms of spread chords and stuff like that. So we introduce modal step distances both forward and backwards for deeper comparison and analysis. So we might also say, like, if you're building a chord and you're looking at the modes, remember that you can kind of move forward and you can move backwards. So we could come up with a system which makes it a little bit easier to visualize what you're doing on the guitar and then basically write that down. Again, that's kind of getting into the weeds. I'll make the argument for it in future presentations, and you can, I'm just following the logic. You can do with it what you will. So what's next? In upcoming presentations, we'll dive deeper into the rationale behind each change, the historical origin of the traditional system, and bridging tools to move between the traditional and modal systems seamlessly. So we're going to go into this in a lot of detail on each step. And each step along the way, I'm going to make the argument of, if we were doing this from today, I believe we would do it differently. And I think the system would be better or faster or easier to learn for some reason. I think everything I'm looking at that I can convince most people of that. I think a neutral jury would say, yeah, that's true. And then if we accept that, then of course that leads to the question of, well, is the speed of learning that way worth me taking on the fact that I'm going to have to also be able to bridge that to the historical system to make that argument? We're going to look at the historical system, how it was put together, and that will allow you to make the argument if it's worth learning two systems or if you just want to be aware of one of the rationale. And then we're going to go into, if we're going to look at both systems, bridging the gap, how can I look at the new system and still be able to bridge the gap, just mentally, logically, as well as with tools these days like ChatGTP, where you could just say, hey, look, ChatGTP, these are the rules I'm using. And ChatGTP, by the way, is great. I've run this by ChatGTP and other AI tools to see if it makes sense logically, and it could just transpose back and forth. So that means that without even a database program designed specifically to transpose, you could just tell the system your logic. Hey, look, this is the way I want to structure it on a modal system. Take this sheet music or take this tablature and convert it. And I think the AI, if not there yet, will soon be to a place where that can happen. So keep that in mind.